On March 15, 1937, Howard Phillips Lovecraft died at the early age of 46 from cancer of the small intestine. As he was laid to rest in Swan Point Cemetery in his beloved hometown of Providence, Rhode Island, little did anyone know that this obscure author of weird fiction and scientific romances would, in time, go on to become one of the giants of modern Western culture. Within a few years of his death, something of an Aeon of Cthulhu would begin to emerge from the world of Lovecraft's offbeat fiction. Central to this would be the Lovecraftian mythos outlined within his ethereal and formless grimoire known as the Necronomicon. The Necronomicon is today one of the most famous as well as infamous books of magical practice and mythological potency which has ever been written. What makes this especially remarkable is that the Necronomicon itself does not actually exist as a real book. It is purely a product of human imagination existing beyond not only paper and printer's ink, but also beyond space-time itself. An incorporeal seed of occult wisdom and practice which germinated initially within the dream oracle of H.P. Lovecraft, that in time would eventually flourish within the minds of countless millions. Ironically, this makes the non-existent Necronomicon perhaps the greatest magical grimoire ever devised, as well as, paradoxically, making H.P. Lovecraft one of the most powerful, if not reluctant, occultists of all time. His Cthulhu mythos is already demonstrating the requirements needed for an emerging religious spiritual tradition. Howard Phillips Lovecraft, for all his grandstanding against the cancers of superstition and the necessity of materialism, nonetheless bridged the gap between the shamans, druids and pagan high priests of the ancient past and up to the chaos magicians of the very present. As Christ held temporary jurisdiction over the Western soul, Cthulhu waited within the subconscious depths, his rudimentary wings useless for flying to heaven, but perfectly suited for soaring into the dreams of men. Yet Lovecraft's work also generated something of an emerging American paganism, in that his cosmic entities are similar to the earliest versions of the Indo-European gods. They care not for the welfare of humans, as we are just one more insignificant aspect in the vast pecking order of cosmic indifference. Gods that are also hermaphroditic. They are beyond comprehension and understanding of the human mind and cannot be placed into moralistic notions of simple good versus evil. We can only know them by the emotional reaction their incomprehensibility generates within us. Yet at the same time, they have an unsettling familiarity about them. They connect the mystery of deep space with the darkness of the deep oceans. We can frame them within our cognition by anthropomorphizing them as subaquatic human hybrids, in a not dissimilar manner to which our ancient shamans dressed as the animals so as to trespass into the spirit world. As the residents of Innsmouth knew well, communion with the deep ones can be accessed by the proactive animism of genetic hybridization. This firstly begins with the incantations of the esoteric order of Dagon inside their lodge. The mind becomes spirit, spirit transforms to flesh, and finally mixed flesh swims into the domain of the eternal dreams within ocean-bed cities far below the reaches of sunlight. These cosmic and subaquatic pagan deities of Lovecraft's dream invocations do not demand to be worshipped, yet they can help the esoterically curious to unlock secrets as well as untap dynamic forces of the universe, which can then allow the willing wizard to attain powers beyond that of the Abrahamic god of the Middle East. As the mad Arab poet Abdul al-Hazred discovered, they can elevate mere humans into godlike magicians to the point where he himself walked away from Islam and opened forbidden gates and peered into the abyss, to eventually bring forth abominations and incomprehensible powers. The God of the Torah, Bible, and Quran become irrelevant when you can become a living God for oneself. Lovecraft was not only an instinctual magician, the Yankee mystic who had his own Shatanic guidance, but he was also unknowingly sowing the seeds of a new American polytheism. Lovecraft even lived the life of a mystic, without luxury and in solitude, so his consciousness could be filled with the opulence of learning. The only thing atheist about H.P. Lovecraft was that he called himself one. In every other regard, he was the seer of Providence. When one even considers Lovecraft's imagery of the gibbous moon, when the moon is not quite full, in the context of heralding the arrival of the paranormal within his stories, it is almost as if he is leaving us with a hint of his hidden occultism. While he presents his materialistic full moon to the world, his occultic gibbous moon is perhaps his real self. If H.P. Lovecraft was indeed a secret occultist, and there's more than enough evidence to suggest he was, then why bother to write in fiction at all? Perhaps he did this for the same reasons that Dennis Wheatley outlined complex magical ritual within his popular novels, and Aleister Crowley wrote his only mainstream work, Moonchild, as a fictional novel in the UK, to avoid legal and social consequences. In the case of Wheatley and Crowley, it was a prosaic matter of avoiding the English witchcraft laws. Other British occultists of the time, such as Dion Fortune, cloaked their sorcery within heavily Christianized overtones for the same reason. As the English witchcraft laws remained on the statute books and had been implemented until the 1950s. In the case of Lovecraft's occultism, in the truest sense of the word, it was to avoid ending up in Butler Hospital. The family legacy of mental illness would have been well known within a respectable Providence. If there is one thing the upper class fear in the test, it is being reminded of their own possible downfall. Lovecraft, writing about esoteric subjects within a safety zone of fiction and criticism, very literally saved them from the asylum. His day-to-day living conditions were also socially and economically vulnerable, having to essentially depend on others to house and feed him. There would have also been an acute, unspoken undercurrent of the family having been cursed at some level, perhaps having travelled through the Phillips family line. Carting H.P. Lovecraft off to the lunatic asylum would have been a very easy way for many people to hide their secrets in shame. If we take the literal meaning of the term occult as meaning secretive or hidden, then Howard Phillips Lovecraft could be considered the greatest occultist of all time. To say that H.P. Lovecraft's childhood was traumatic would be an understatement. Born into a happy and loving family of some wealth and stature, it was all to go horribly wrong, and very quickly indeed, with the tragic death of his father. Winfield Scott Lovecraft's demise was a strange and dark episode involving a sudden mania while away on business in Chicago. Although his fall into the abyss had been generally attributed to the contraction of syphilis, this remains questionable, as neither Lovecraft's mother nor Lovecraft himself demonstrated any sign of the condition. What is certain is that the sudden deterioration of Winfield Scott Lovecraft became the opening salvo in a war against Lovecraft's idyllic childhood. This brings up the question: was the Lovecraft family cursed, and did his mother Sarah somehow know this? Despite being from New England Puritan stock and constantly making note of his Anglo-Saxon heritage, both sides of the Lovecraft family line originated in the Celtic parts of England. Deriving from such heritage makes it almost impossible to escape the folk traditions and superstitions of the Celt's far vision of weird and hidden things, as Lovecraft referred to this ability within his story, The Horror at Red Hook. Like so many Puritans who arrived in the New World from the English West Country, ethnically they were more likely to be of Celtic heritage than Anglo-Saxon. Lovecraft would be no exception to this, regardless of his own wasp chauvinism. One of the most puzzling anomalies as to why Lovecraft's mother dressed him as a little girl when he was growing up has always perplexed his biographers. Usually a Freudian overtone is brought out to explain this. However, Sarah Phillips dressing her son as a girl in early childhood may have a more supernatural aspect to it. Perhaps concerns about her son as a young child may have unlocked racial and cultural codes within her ancestral memories. In Celtic countries, of which the English West Country is very much a part of, young boys were often dressed as little girls so as to ward off the fairies. Fairies were taken very seriously in such cultures, and the belief was that boys in their early childhood years were more likely to be abducted in their sleep and taken to fairyland. So mothers within the Celtic lands would deliberately dress their sons as little girls, even going as far as giving them girls' names in order to protect them from the fairies, disguising them as little girls wearing petticoats in a purely superficial visual way. Even among Protestants in Celtic lands, such as Ulster in Ireland, this was not uncommon. The same would have been prevalent within Lovecraft's ancestral lands of the English West Country. This belief was so common and widespread that even Oscar Wilde's mother, who was of a high-ranking Anglo-Irish stock, did the same to her own son, and for the same reason. When Lovecraft was a child, he began having horrific nightmares of a non-human nocturnal visitation by what he termed as the Night-gaunts. Was his mother Sarah Phillips aware of some curse or supernatural vulnerability within the family that she felt the need to protect her son from? Was her young son's stories of his nightmares far more significant to his mother than just childhood fantasy and trauma? H.P. Lovecraft described the Night-gaunts as being vaguely humanoid with no faces and thin wings. They would snatch the young Lovecraft up by the stomach and carry him away. What Lovecraft is describing here is an experience very similar to the fairy abductions of the Celtic world, as well as the UFO abductions of the modern era. Such experiences tend to be visualized by the abductee within their own cultural framework of familiarity, although the experience is universal and has been recorded by humans since the dawn of time. At the same time, the young Lovecraft, as a result of having read 1001 Nights, became obsessed with all things Arabic and began collecting pottery and other artifacts from the Islamic world. The book, which derives its content from Arabic, Indian, Greek, Jewish, as well as Persian and Yemenite pagan folklore, includes tales of the Ifrit, a powerful form of Jinn. The Jinn are ostensibly the fairies meets demons of the Islamic world, although the archetype extends far back into the pre-Islamic and Abrahamic periods of the Middle East. So consumed with these tales that the young Lovecraft even told people he was converting to Islam. This went as far as Lovecraft collecting the antiques and other objects of the Arabic world to surround himself with in his bedroom. There is a belief within Islamic culture that the supernatural race known as the Jinn can reside within such objects as vases, boxes, and other storage vessels and containers, the genie in the bottle being the most commonly known form. Did Lovecraft as a child unleash, via his incredible ability to concentrate at such an early age, some form of Jinn from one of these Arabic objects? Coupled with this, that his mother somehow knew her son was vulnerable to being targeted by entities, and she instinctually knew this from her own racial memories. It was also at this time that the young H.P. Lovecraft began calling himself Abdul al-Hazred, the fictional, in the material world sense, author of the Necronomicon. The name came to Lovecraft in a dream. Did H.P. Lovecraft, as a child, release the Jinn from the bottle, and was that Jinn in fact Cthulhu? It is important to look beyond cultural and even racial identities when considering these supernatural beings, which have been always part and parcel of the human experience. Ultimately, what we call demons, fairies, dibbuks, Jinn, and even grey aliens are all the same experience, which are encapsulated within comprehensible forms and identities, running concurrent with the culture of the time. The question must then be asked whether or not Howard Phillips Lovecraft was chosen to become the channeler of a pantheon of new American pagan gods and demons, which we now know today as the Cthulhu mythos. One thing is for certain, and that is, as Lovecraft progressed from childhood and into adolescence and then early adulthood, his deteriorating sense of self, derived from both his family dying around him, complete with his collapsing economic and social identity, presents us with a prime example of a shamanic sacrifice, taking him from the comfort and safety of his well-to-do early childhood and plunging him into the abyss of personal annihilation, only for Lovecraft to emerge from this abyss, or from the labyrinth, with a visionary and supernatural ability to channel messages from the gods of the future through his writing. As these entities exist outside of our present human space-time, it also allows us to understand how Lovecraft could predict so much of our future as a species, as well as give remarkable details of overseas locations and historical events his physical body had never experienced personally. As with any great magician, the creation of a new reality is derived from the manifestation and predictions summoned into the present through the concentration of the creative will. Like Jack Parsons, a seer of the gods, of the non-material realms of both earth and space. It was no coincidence that both these magicians were born into American society at just the right time. When it comes to the spiritual and the paranormal, there are three kinds of people. 1. Individuals who have had spiritual and or paranormal experiences and just accept them for what they are. 2. Individuals whom, for whatever reason, are simply unable to experience spiritual or paranormal states and who are genuinely baffled when they encounter people who have experienced the otherworldly. 3. Individuals who have had a spiritual and or paranormal experience and then wish they had not. In February 1924, the hugely popular escape artist Harry Houdini contacted founder and owner of Weird Tales magazine J.C. Henenberger about publishing an account of Houdini's strange but real-life experiences while in Egypt in 1910. According to Houdini, he had been kidnapped by a tour guide, and this abduction was a ruse to lure him to come face to face with a huge unknown subterranean god. The kidnapper was called Abdul Reis el Drogman, whom Houdini claimed resembled an ancient pharaoh more than a modern Arabic Bedouin, and who, after an elaborate ruse, threw the escapologist into a chamber beneath the Great Sphinx of Giza. The purpose of this kidnapping was to test Houdini's stage magic against the real magic performed by an ancient secret society. Houdini, having been stunned from the fall, awakened at the bottom of a deep pit. Not surprisingly, he manages to free himself from the ropes which bound him. He then begins to follow the course of a dark cavern in an attempt to find his way out. Believing he is following draft from the outside air, Houdini finds himself going deeper and deeper into the bowels of the earth below the Great Sphinx. After falling down a flight of stairs in the dark, he arrives in a large ceremonial cavern. Houdini then claimed in complete seriousness that he had encountered an army of half-human and half-animal mummies. These are led in procession by Houdini recognizes as the ancient Egyptian pharaohs Khephren and Nitocris. The purpose of this procession is to sacrifice offerings to a gigantic subterranean, multi-tentacled entity. Eventually, upon escaping, Houdini later put down the entire experience to being a hallucination. By remarkable synchronicity, H.P. Lovecraft was given the task of fictionalizing Houdini's now apparently hallucinatory experiences while under the Great Sphinx. Eventually these were published in the May, June, July edition of Weird Tales. Houdini was greatly impressed with Lovecraft's writing, and the two struck up a working friendship which was to last until Houdini's death in 1926. However, the two men had something far more in common than just a taste for a ripping yarn and a good adventure story. Both men on the surface would spend their entire lives railing against the supernatural, while behind the scenes were unable to discount it completely and continued to research and explore the occult and paranormal in great depth, something which in public they claimed to have no belief in. Playing something of a devil's advocate here, it could be argued that both Lovecraft and Houdini were apparently in denial of incorporeal realities beyond the material existence, which bothered them both greatly, for no other reason than it literally haunted them. Because at some deeper unspoken level they knew that the paranormal was real. However, being unable to scientifically explain it, they sought to eradicate it. In the case of Houdini, his debunking of the spiritualist movement of the late Victorian and early 20th century, and with Lovecraft resolving it all into scientific romances and fantasy horror stories. In the case of Harry Houdini, this drive derived from an attempt to contact his late mother during a seance in Atlantic City, in 1922. According to his then close friend, the British writer Arthur Conan Doyle, a genuine communication from the spirit world was indeed delivered to Houdini, and that the famous escapologist was deeply moved by the event. However, for some reason later on, Houdini raged against the experience and refused to believe it. This sudden change of heart eventually led to a breakdown in the friendship between Conan Doyle and Harry Houdini. From that point on, Houdini became almost messianic in his crusades against the supernatural and the paranormal. A very similar reaction could also be applied to H.P. Lovecraft following his initial Night-gaunts experience, and then later the still mysterious 5 years following the death of his high-ranking Freemasonic grandfather, Whipple Van Buren Phillips. Following the death of his greatly beloved grandfather and mentor, is it possible that the young H.P. Lovecraft experimented in the occult in an attempt to contact Whipple Van Buren Phillips, perhaps using a text from his grandfather's Freemasonic library? Did the young Lovecraft instead, as in the case of Harry Houdini under the Great Sphinx, also encounter his own multi-tentacled entity from beyond? Is this what Houdini and Lovecraft really had in common? That they both came face to face with the paranormal, and rather than accept it, turned towards dismissing it, or fictionalizing their experiences away. More intriguingly, were the two men fated to be brought together? Were they both kidnapped, in the mystical sense of the term, by the same archetype which Houdini called Abdul Rees el Drogman and Lovecraft called Abdul al-Hazred? Another correlation can be made with the mystical journey made by Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst Carl Jung during his purposeful exercises in conscious dreaming following his own nervous breakdown, which eventually was to become the Red Book. This took place from 1913 to about 1917, and which came to be known as Jung's creative illness. Later in 1957, Jung explained his experiences, and it gives us an insight into what perhaps Lovecraft was forcing himself against, and which clearly disturbed him greatly. The years when I pursued the inner images were the most important time of my life. Everything else is to be derived from this. It began at that time, and the later details hardly matter anymore. My entire life consisted in elaborating what had burst forth from the unconscious and had flooded me like an enigmatic stream and threatened to break me. That was the stuff and material for more than only one life. Everything later was merely the outer classification, scientific elaboration, and the integration into life. One can hardly blame an old world Yankee such as Lovecraft for reacting towards the supernatural in the way he did. He may even on some levels have blamed the cancer of superstition for the downfall of his family standing within Providence society. Not to mention his own 5 lost years where he claimed to have done almost nothing, yet was awake every night into the morning hours, if not in his room then wandering the streets of Providence, seeking answers to provide him with his own escape route out of the abyss. If he had, in fact, found these answers, and considering the context and content of his writing, he probably did, then like Harry Houdini, he was determined to fictionalize them out of his conscious mind. Ironically, Harry Houdini and Howard Phillips Lovecraft both fought against the ancient Egyptian concept of Ka, that being the principal aspect of the soul of a human being or of that of a god. The Ka survived the death of the body and could reside in the image or statue of a person. much like the psychic impetus generated by the bas-relief of Cthulhu within the sunken city in the South Pacific known as Rael, the horror in clay sculpted by the young Wilcox in the opening chapter of H.P. Lovecraft's most famous work, The Call of Cthulhu. A recurring theme within some of Lovecraft's writings is that of an American returning to their ancestral home in the Old World, driven by romantic, escapist notions of honouring their ancestors by means of reclaiming the family legacy, only to discover that their materialistic attempts to recapture their own past results in their own destruction. An ancestral legacy which reveals itself as something of a curse, and one which had originally given rise to the family moving to the New World for a very good reason indeed. Again, was this symbolic of Lovecraft being concerned about something within his own family line of a similar supernatural nature which he brought into his fiction? In the March 1924 edition of Weird Tales, Lovecraft's short story The Rats in the Wall was published. It tells of an American of the old and influential De la Poer family moving back to his ancestral home in England from Massachusetts following a sudden tragic death within the family. Against the wishes of the locals, De la Poer begins to restore the old family home, known as Exham Priory, to the opulence and architectural stature it had once been before falling into ruins. Yet no sooner was this achieved than his black cat becomes obsessed with the sound of rats scurrying behind the newly restored walls. Soon things turn much darker as, via a combination of dreams and exploring the depths below the house, Delaporte discovers that his family once raised humans for centuries as meat for their own consumption. This human farming had been going on since Celtic times and was the reason for his family being so hated among the locals. The Delaportes had also practiced their own ancient religion. This abomination of human meat farming only stopped when an ancestor murdered the entire family and then fled to America, leaving thousands of rats to eat the trapped human cattle below Exham Priory. One immediate comparison, which the rats in the wall reveals, and that is to a passage in Carl Jung's seminal work Man and His Symbols, in which Jung reveals to Sigmund Freud his dream about the lower underground levels of a house which he was compelled to explore. In the dream, almost identical to Delaporte's discoveries within Lovecraft's The Rats on the Wall, Carl Jung goes on a remarkable, similar journey of historical discovery below this dream house. This dream eventually led to Jung developing his own theory of the collective unconscious. H.P. Lovecraft and Carl Jung, both via dreams and imagination, were utilizing a method of shamanism employed by the Celtic Druids, in which personal and collective psychological insights were derived from nocturnal subconscious exploration. Within The Rats in the Wall, Delaporte becomes insane due to the revelations of his family's hidden past, and assumes a state not unlike that of Lovecraft's real-life Dark Night of the Soul, which he had endured for 5 years following the death of his beloved grandfather. Did H.P. Lovecraft, during those 5 traumatic years as a teenager, peel back the wallpaper on his own legacy? To date, one of the common handicaps when it comes to approaching the writings of H.P. Lovecraft has mainly been to do with critics unable to grasp the genuine esoteric foundations of Lovecraft's writings as a result of the worldview they are deriving their assumptions from. Leaving aside the incorporation of the Cthulhu mythos into the world of chaos magic, these general assumptions have come about as a result of diving into the Lovecraft work with an atheistic or that of a monotheistic Judeo-Christian Islamic Abrahamic monotheistic consciousness. These applied frameworks led to the simplified elements of good and evil eventually saturating into Lovecraft's complex and multifaceted mythos within the public consciousness as a whole. Lovecraft never directly stated that his pantheon of Providence distillated cosmic beings were evil. Rather, it is the reaction, in most instances horror and revulsion, that the characters within his stories applied towards the likes of Azathoth, Cthulhu, or the Shoggoths and the Mi-Go. The humans who behold them, either directly or by comprehension of their existence, go mad or kill themselves. However, they alone chose to destroy themselves, either by insanity or suicide, and therefore the Outer Ones, or the Great Old Ones, can hardly be held accountable in this regard. When one begins to consider the Cthulhu mythos from that of a polytheistic Indo-European pagan or Hindu consciousness, then this pantheon of gods, beings and races takes on a very different nature indeed. They become transformed from the exclusively monstrous and towards the epic, from the abominable and on towards the mythological. They may be nothing like our concepts of life and consciousness we are familiar with on this planet. Nevertheless, they are still very much another layer within the pecking order of nature and the cosmos, which just so it happens are indifferent to our petty and less than insignificant human mortal existence. Upon this realization, suddenly the Christian with Bible in hand is left stunned by the concept of gods who really don't have an interest in him or her. One's personal sins or virtues are irrelevant, as the gods have their own business to attend to. You don't matter. Why should you to a boundless daemon, a gigantic sultan of interdimensional space and time, and one which bubbles at the centre of all infinity, and sitting on a throne at the centre of the ultimate chaos? The most terrifying concept to an Abrahamic mind is the idea of a supreme being who has no interest in them personally. Yet, when one removes oneself from this idea of being under the personal stewardship of a personal God, then this can be seen as what it really is: personal liberation. When your God abandons you, you seize it as an opportunity towards personal enlightenment. You become the arbiter of your own fate. Isn't this what Lovecraft is really telling us? You are not forsaken. Rather, you are now in charge of your own destiny. As gods and goddesses become archetypes of experiences and understanding, along with pathways to magical trajectories. Yet such ideas and beliefs are not uncommon among humanity. They are central to polytheism, as well as heathen spiritual, cosmological associations. The gods are supposed to move in mysterious ways. It is also perfectly fine that we do not fully understand them and only know them by how they affect us. So what if they do or do not care if you sin behind closed doors? The universe is too big, and a single personal human life is so insignificant. This realization is what really leads to the characters within Lovecraft stories becoming insane or want to kill themselves. Nothing is more horrifying to a modern Western person than the concept that they really don't matter in the scheme of things. We may have developed a delusional assumption that we are somehow important within our own personal associations, education level, class system or race. However, below the waves of the sea, or outside the Earth's atmosphere, among the cold, in the darkness of space, we are instantly reduced to debris. Our cherished sense of self-identity, complete with all the opinions, assumptions, feelings and inclinations poured into this, can only exist within a microscopic bandwidth of the vast cosmological spectrum. However, Lovecraft, in the truest mystical sense, he presents his readers with a third option for us mortals to consider, and that is to accommodate his pantheon of abominations into our lives. We can simply worship them or draw inspiration from their power and might. We can use the non-material faculties present within them to change the reality around us by unleashing the magic and sorceries attainable by doing so. We can even become genetically modified with them, so we might procure a taste of godhood itself. expand the bandwidth of our own biological limitations. Lovecraft places far more options on the table than dying in an asylum or by the flash of one's own revolver. One of the best Lovecraft stories for outlining these concepts is The Shadow over Innsmouth, written during November and December 1931, and is the only Lovecraft story which was published in book form during his lifetime. In many ways it can be considered something of a spiritual text, as it contains a very overtly classical mythological journey with strong shamanic elements that impact upon a student during a historical tour of New England in the early decades of the 20th century. So many of the elements we have come to see within Jungian psychology, and then later within the monomyths of Joseph Campbell and his hero's journey, can be found within The Shadow over Innsmouth. It is all there, from plunging instinctively into the mysterious and strange locations, gazing upon magical objects held from unlikely strangers, and even the dark night of the soul before the final rebirth, are all contained within this remarkable story. The narrator is the voice of the same student who embarks upon visiting the antiquarian sites of New England, and the town of Innsmouth initially enters his consciousness when he becomes aware of a highly secretive and apparently violent incursion into the town by US government federal agents. The events and details appear shady and somewhat disturbing, to the point whereby even civil rights organizations stayed out of the government operation. The epicenter of this seems to be a location just off the harbour of Innsmouth, among a natural formation known as Devil Reef. This is superb storytelling on the behalf of Lovecraft, as he has the reader hooked from the get-go. Being 21 years old, the student narrator of the story then embarks upon a tour of the present and past, which will also unfold secrets of his own personal psychology and fate in the future. Like the Fool card in the tarot, he is the infant ego stepping into consciousness. He is being led on his journey as much as initiating it for himself. He discovers that the transport options into Innsmouth are very limited, with the old Boston and Maine railroad line running into the town having been abandoned years ago. And today, the only form of public transport still serving Innsmouth is an infrequent motor coach bus service which traverses the bad roads on its way to the mysterious seaport town. The ticket agent at Newburyport, where the story begins, relays some information about the decline of Innsmouth and its strange-looking citizens, whom he compares to southern white trash. We are told that Innsmouth once had a successful gold refinery and busy port, but was all in decay now. The once thriving town had lost most of its population, and the wealthy Marsh family who controlled the town had also mirrored the decline of the general populace. Inbreeding with women brought back to Innsmouth from the South Pacific was apparently to blame, but this is just a local assumption in Newburyport. As the narrator has time to kill before the arrival of the bus to Innsmouth, he investigates further into the nature and the history of Innsmouth and discovers that locals in Newburyport find the place sinister and repugnant. Eventually his curiosity leads him to a local museum in Newburyport which contains an exhibit of a piece of jewellery made from Innsmouth gold, which is like nothing else on this earth. The design and symbolism bears no relationship to anything either modern, avant-garde, or of a primitive nature. It is almost as if the piece was designed by a non-human consciousness. The object, along with its strangeness, only want to make the young student more eager to explore Innsmouth. The bus journey itself from Newburyport to Innsmouth is filled with shamanic overtones, the strangeness of the passengers, the unfamiliarity of the landscape, the enduring sense of entering a place which is outside the pale of what one would come to expect to be typical in New England. Another example of Lovecraft's sublime blending of real life and fictional location so seamlessly that it creates a complementary reality which straddles between both states of being, and one which allows the magical and supernatural easier access to our consciousness. Further to this, by extension, it also takes us into an occultic realm where the rules of everyday life become irrelevant, and the material universe takes on an element of arbitrary plasticity. We can step into the labyrinth of the unknown so as to encounter the fantastical. The motor coach journey itself is very much a plunge into the unknown and comes with the necessary vulnerability needed to let go of the mundane and to enter into the supernatural, as the bus rattles through the landscape made of strange woodlands and vast salt marshes. These natural formations of the landscape then act as a cautionary threshold which one needs to traverse in order to reach Innsmouth, the salted magical circle surrounding the town that only the willing neophyte with a sense of personal destiny would and can traverse. While looking around at his strange fellow passengers, the narrator almost instinctually knows the fate which awaits him, the bus driver being the Yankee version of Charon in Greek mythology, the ferryman of Hades, who carries souls across the river Styx from the world of the living and onto the world of the dead. Upon arrival in Innsmouth, he discovers a mostly dilapidated and deserted old fishing town. The few locals he does notice are all blue-eyed and narrow-headed, who walk in a shambling manner. We are told that Captain Obed Marsh, head of one of Innsmouth's most important families, started a cult in Innsmouth known as the Esoteric Order of Dagon, derived from a religion practiced by certain Polynesian islanders which he had encountered during his travels. Soon after, upon abandoning the Christian religion and discarding Freemasonry for the Esoteric Order of Dagon, Innsmouth's fortunes as a commercial centre flourished. The deities worshipped by the Esoteric Order of Dagon are Father Dagon and Mother Hydra, and also Cthulhu, Father Dagon and Mother Hydra being considered semi-divine hybrids. Eventually making his way to the waterfront area, which is also in ruins, and standing by a silted-up harbour, useless for servicing even the modest seafaring vessels, the narrator catches his first sight of the infamous Devil Reef. And far out to sea, despite a high tide, I glimpsed a long black line, scarcely rising above the water, yet carrying a suggestion of odd latent malignancy. This, I knew, must be Devil Reef. As I looked, a subtle, curious sense of beckoning seemed super added to the grim repulsion, and oddly enough, I found this overtone more disturbing than the primary impression. Subconsciously at this point, the narrator is reluctantly aware that he cannot return to either Newburyport or even New England as the same person. The decayed buildings of Innsmouth are representative of the obsolescence of his previous normal existence. The person he was before his arrival in Innsmouth is not the person he is now, although the narrator will, as a result, enter into his own dark night of the soul, both within his room at the Gilman Hotel and also upon his superficial escape from Innsmouth and the months and years afterwards. His fate is nevertheless to return, his darkest fears in reality being a seed planted within his subconscious awareness in tandem with his genetic destiny for him to take his place among the deep ones of Devil Reef. This has been a one-way journey, and he can never go home again. The shadow which hung over Innsmouth was very much one of a Jungian kind. Lovecraft is telling the reader that we cannot escape what we are fated to be, but we can embrace it and flourish within our own monomyth rather than let our opposition to it tear us asunder. There is an Innsmouth within all of us, and how we deal with it is up to us. We can either go mad from denial, or walk the dilapidated streets knowing that the esoteric order of Dagon exists to help us if we wish. This is what makes Lovecraft's story, The Shadow over Innsmouth, a benchmark in modern Western mythology and spirituality. In his 1927 story entitled The Whisperer in the Darkness, Lovecraft wrote, "Yuggoth is a strange dark orb at the very rim of our solar system. There are mighty cities on Yuggoth, great tiers of terraced towers built of black stone. The sun shines there no brighter than a star, but the beings need no light. They have other, subtler senses, and put no windows in their great houses and temples. The black rivers of pitch that flow under those mysterious cyclopean bridges, things built by some elder race extinct and forgotten before the beings came to Yuggoth from the ultimate voids, ought to be enough to make any man a Dante or Poe if he can keep sane long enough to tell what he has seen." When Pluto was discovered 3 years later in 1930, Lovecraft wrote to his friend James F. Morton that Yuggoth might probably be the same as Pluto. The discovery of Pluto in many ways was the commencement of the swan song era of Lovecraft's magical abilities. The distinction between his writing and what was to become known in the 1970s as chaos magic was hardly distinguishable by the time the 1930s had arrived. Lovecraft was very literally creating the future in close to real time. The art and science of his imagination bringing change within the material world. A journey which he had first embarked upon following the death of his beloved grandfather, and then the downfall of his family's social status. H.P. Lovecraft's Mythos reminds us that we humans, within the greater schemes of things, are little more than two-legged insects once we move from beyond the narrow range of our civilization. In stories such as The Shadow over Innsmouth, humans become something akin to provisional moths or butterflies, awaiting an incomprehensible metamorphosis into that of a subaquatic marine hybrid, infused with newly unleashed physical and psychological abilities, allowing us to transcend our earthly states, with the occasional indulgence of manifesting among the above sea nostalgia of Devil Reef, if only to remind themselves of the world they left behind and why they did so. There is no white trash nor lesser races in the places human civilization can never reach. But this transformation comes with a potentially horrific price. We might transcend from the human mortal realms to experience all the wonders of the cosmos, not normally accessible to us. Or we could just as easily find ourselves pinned inside the display cabinet of curiosities belonging to some interstellar, interdimensional daemonic magi at the center of all chaos. Our curiosity having led us into becoming nothing more than a specimen as we gaze upon the transforming, crawling chaos, Nyarlathotep, the spawn of Azathoth at the center of the Milky Way. Nyarlathotep is the shapeshifter who walks among humans as a tall, slim, joyous man before transforming to anyone his sanity annihilating thousand forms. The terror invoked within us by either Nyarlathotep or his father Azathoth is nothing personal. These entities are just merely playing their own roles within the cosmic order of things, and what effects they have upon humans who behold them is irrelevant. It is what it is. Is this how ants consider us humans to be when we cast our own shadow across an anthill before we unknowingly trample it down as we carry on our merry way, oblivious of the cataclysmic destruction left in the wake of our uncaring footsteps? So much is made of Lovecraft's alleged dislike of what he considered degenerate groups. Something of a psychohistorical analysis, and a cheap one at that, is forever being applied in order to portray Lovecraft's non-human aberrations as a metaphor for his attitude towards other races and ethnic groups. However, what his biographers readily seem to ignore is that these so-called inferiors are portrayed mainly as individuals, or else as some element of disruption within the collective. They are generally not indicative of the whole. As a result, Lovecraft's so-called racist views are merely an acknowledgement of the tribal structure. Moreover, tribes can be subjected to degeneracy, and this is only considered degenerate depending upon what social and cultural conditioning is present within the observer. In the case of contact with supernatural beings, the degeneracy takes the form of a return to paganism, a rejection of the arbitrary statutes of the King James Bible, the savage replacing the Puritan. Why? Because sometimes it is necessary. Magical and shamanic endeavours being unleashed in order to experience something of a quantum entanglement with the unseen forces and outer tribes not otherwise accessible to human sensory awareness. Are the respectable Mayflower Yankees who embark upon the same degenerate sorceries, such as Tillinghast from Lovecraft's short story From Beyond, any less degenerate than the Louisiana cult within the Call of Cthulhu? The answer is clearly no. Lovecraft makes it perfectly clear that there are also white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, otherwise respectable degenerates, and they appear all throughout his stories. This is the real autobiographic subtext within Lovecraft's work. He is in many ways a victim of his own tribal degeneracy, his own sorceries and artistic conjurations. And what is the objective of this degeneracy? To move beyond the mundane, to transcend the mediocre, to sail the Mayflower into the abyss and smash it upon the Plymouth Rock of the unimaginable realms, scattering it into a trillion subatomic particles so as to reorder its fragments into an interstellar craft capable of crossing dimensions of space and time, to catch a glimpse of one's own limitations so as to push against the demarcation line of the artificial construct of race and social stature and towards something more, something different, something vitally terrifying, to come face to face with the painful insignificance of our own species as a whole. This is liberation, and is not annihilation. And therein lies the freedom of the white trash of Innsmouth, as well as the Italico-Semitico-Mongoloids of New York's Lower East Side. Such tribes exist to mock the respectable and the aristocrats, remind them that their sense of superiority and safety is completely a sham, as the young Lovecraft discovered with the downfall of his own family. When this point of social and psychological downfall occurs, then sorcery comes to the fore. The pagan emerges from the shadow. Lovecraft's own Mayflower tribe had failed his father, grandfather and mother, and Howard Phillips Lovecraft was not going to allow himself to be also walked across the threshold of Butler Hospital. He was going to cross over into the abyss instead. The Necronomicon, operating as something of an instinctual software program, running within his subconscious mind so as to allow him to navigate away from his family curse. It was the 5 years of his own reclusive degeneracy which saved the young Lovecraft. He was the Necronomicon, downloaded from some unknown realm and routed through his dreams, imagination and creativity. Lovecraft became the conduit between the mortal and the pantheon of New American pagan gods, which had called upon Lovecraft so as to mutually cross the abyss of space and time and into the collective consciousness of humanity as a whole. The discovery of Pluto was the manifestation of Yuggoth. No matter how much his fans and biographers play down this as a coincidence, Howard Phillips Lovecraft knew it was much more than that of a glib, casual coincidence, as he himself lived in an age whereby the abyss was becoming increasingly accessible to Western shamans who themselves were open towards stepping across that threshold and into the abyss of the unknown. The period of history between 1888 and 1933 can be considered something of a psychic portal, when a new consciousness cycle took place within the Western mind, an evolutionary window of opportunity for the new generation of Western shamans to channel from their subconscious conjurations into reality. This was the era when the limitations of space and time transformed miracles into experiments. The development of aviation, submarines, rocketry, quantum physics, radio, television, and magnetic recording systems were augmented with the emergence of new forms of sorceries and philosophies. Lovecraft was born, lived, and died among the likes of Nikola Tesla, Aleister Crowley, Austin Osman Spare, Jack Parsons, and Carl Jung. His work was complementary to these minds, as he was one of the conduits availing of the same streams of quantum and psychic conjurations which created the enormous changes that were to herald in the modern age. It was no coincidence that Howard Phillips Lovecraft died just as IBM were marketing their first computers. Lovecraft's current popularity owes much to his charismatic charge, illuminating millions of personal computers all over the world. His mythos saturated into the oracle of the present, the scrying screen of the internet. The beautifully written prose of his most famous work, The Call of Cthulhu, has become something of a mantra for millions, because within its passages is the entirety of the modern human spiritual experience, seeking equilibrium within the technological possibilities of the future, and this is perfectly harnessed and set into words by Lovecraft. Grammar and grimoire become the same thing. The reader is very literally spellbound by the story. The text flows with an almost musical sense of meandering narrative, building up a charge with an ever-present undertone of tension, coupled with revelation. And, as always, it is the reader who can choose to react to the revelations as they unfold. When these gods are viewed through a pagan or polytheistic mind, they are not so terrifying after all. In fact, such terror or shadow gods serve a vital and necessary function within one's spiritual development, if we allow them to. The famous opening passage within the Horror in Clay section of The Call of Cthulhu has become one of the most famous and oft-quoted pieces of English language literature. We were not meant to travel far, at least in our physical bodies. Lovecraft proved this by creating an entire universe from his beloved Providence. He pulled in an alien cosmology and new pantheon of American pagan gods into his writing desk. He did not require a spacecraft or time machine. The Necronomicon was more than adequate for this purpose. Within The Call of Cthulhu, an often overlooked passage tells us much about the psychic internal state of Lovecraft and what kind of shamanic trance he may have been caught within during his frantic writing episodes. On April 2nd, about 3 p.m, every trace of Wilcox's malady suddenly ceased. He sat upright in bed, astonished to find himself at home and completely ignorant of what had happened in dream or reality since the night of March 22nd. Pronounced well by his physician, he returned to his quarters in 3 days. But to Professor Angel he was of no further assistance. All traces of strange dreaming had vanished with his recovery, and my uncle kept no record of his night thoughts after a week of pointless and irrelevant accounts of thoroughly usual visions. Here is Lovecraft, recounting the end of his 5 mysterious years as a young man, when his own malady had overtaken him and then eventually departed him. The young Wilcock in The Call of Cthulhu is Howard Phillips Lovecraft presenting his own biographical details in not so cryptic form. The 5 mysterious years where Lovecraft became an oddball recluse was the secret college of his own shamanic journey. Like the hermit card in the tarot, he was to find the secrets within the solitary mystical journey. Lovecraft's underlying message is that when we humans venture further into the depths of space, or even into the depths of the oceans, the further we are taken away from the self. This is the real objective of the Necronomicon, to stop looking into the places we were not meant to travel towards, and to look into oneself to discover the real mysteries hidden within the depths of our own subconscious minds. Since the death of Lovecraft, this concept of deep space not being the place for humanity has been portrayed in popular cinema such as Arthur C. Clarke's Stanley Kubrick's 1968 movie 2001: A Space Odyssey and the 2019 movie Ad Astra. Lovecraft's philosophy, if we can call it such, is there to be seen in so much of popular science fiction and what we call modern philosophy for those willing to accept it. Lovecraft bridged the divide between the work of painters from Charles Burchfield's almost psychedelic regionalism to the Gothic cosmism of H.R. Geiger. While much has been made of Aleister Crowley's magic having generated the modern world into manifestation, there is no doubt that H.P. Lovecraft is a catalyst binding it all together. And that the title of this catalyst is the invisible book which the Night-gaunts handed to the young Lovecraft for him to be the most unlikely magi of the technological and scientific age. And that is the real Necronomicon.